The sun hung low over the small town of Deadwood, Texas, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. It was one of those lazy afternoons where the air felt thick with heat, and the only sounds you could hear were the creaking of old porch swings and the distant hum of a lone cicada. Deadwood was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where secrets had a funny way of coming to the surface. But some stories were too dark, too terrible to speak of. And there was one story, a tale so haunting that even the bravest of the locals refused to acknowledge it. The story of the torture house. The house stood at the edge of town like a forgotten relic from a time best left in the past. It was a massive, decaying structure, once grand in its heyday, but now nothing more than a shell of its former self. The paint had peeled away long ago, exposing the splintered wood beneath. The windows were boarded up, and the roof sagged in places, as though it was slowly giving in to the weight of time. Still, there was something about the place that made it impossible to ignore. Even the wind seemed to avoid it, as though it was afraid of what lay inside. The torture house had been abandoned for decades, but the feeling of dread that surrounded it never left. Over the years, people had come and gone, each with their own version of the tale. Some swore they saw strange shadows flickering through the boarded-up windows at night. Others claimed to have heard strange noises, faint whispers carried on the wind, soft footsteps echoing through the empty halls. But the most chilling reports came from those who ventured too close. They said that the house itself had a life of its own, that it would beckon the curious, drawing them in like moths to a flame. At night, when the moon was high and the air turned cold, the sounds would begin. The faintest cries for help, barely audible, would seep through the cracks in the wall. The locals had learned long ago to stay away from the torture house. It wasn't just the stories that scared them. It was the fear of the unknown. No one knew exactly what had happened there all those years ago. But the legends were enough to make even the bravest souls hesitate. There were whispers of dark rituals, of torture and madness, of a family that had disappeared without a trace. Some said the house had been the site of unspeakable horrors, a place where the living were turned into the dead. Others believed it was a prison for souls, cursed to roam the halls forever. But there was one thing that everyone could agree on. The house was evil. It had an aura of malevolence, a presence that seemed to watch and wait for its next victim. And yet, despite the fear it instilled, there were always a few who thought they could conquer it, those who believed that they could brave. There had been reports of people getting too close, standing on the edge of the property just long enough to feel the chill in the air, to hear the distant cries coming from inside. Most would turn and run, terrified by the sensation of being watched. But a few, a foolish few, would take a step closer, their curiosity getting the better of them. Some said they saw figures moving behind the windows, glimpses of something or someone lurking in the dark. Others claimed they felt a cold hand brush against their shoulder or heard their name whispered in the wind. And then there were the ones who never came back. The most recent case was that of the McAllister family. They were new to Deadwood, having just moved into town a few months earlier. Like many newcomers, they had heard the rumors about the torture house. But instead of running from it, they decided to investigate. One evening, after dinner, they gathered the courage to walk down the dirt road that led to the house. It wasn't far from their new home, just a short walk past the old cemetery and the abandoned church. They had no idea what they were getting themselves into. As they reached the edge of the property, they paused. The house stood before them, dark and silent. The air was thick with an oppressive heaviness, like the world itself was holding its breath. But the McAllisters pressed on, eager to prove that the stories were just that, stories. They ventured up to the porch, where the floorboards groaned under their weight. The door was locked, but there were cracks in the walls, gaps where the boards had begun to shift. As they peered through one of these cracks, they saw something. Movement. The briefest glimpse of a figure standing motionless inside the house, watching them. "Let's go," Mrs. McAllister said, her voice trembling. But it was too late. Before anyone could react, the wind howled through the trees, and the door to the house creaked open. Slowly, as though guided by an unseen hand, the McAllisters stepped inside. And that was the last time anyone saw them. The town searched for days, but there was no trace of the family. No sign of their clothes, no footprints, nothing. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The police chalked it up to an accident, maybe a fall or an animal attack. But the townspeople knew better. They knew that once someone entered the torture house, there was no coming out. The story of the McAllisters' disappearance was added to the long list of strange occurrences surrounding the house. It was just another chapter in a tale that had been passed down for generations. And yet, despite all the warnings, the house still stood there waiting. The legends lived on, and as time passed, the house only grew more sinister. People said it had a way of calling out to those who dared to listen, that it could reach into their souls and make them do things they never thought possible. Some believed the house was cursed. Others believed it was the work of something much darker. But no one could deny the one truth that everyone in Deadwood agreed on. The torture house was a place of pure evil. And no matter how many years passed, It would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next fool to get too close. So, the legend continued. As long as the torture house stood, it would haunt the town of Deadwood, because some stories are meant to be told, and some stories are meant to be forgotten. But the torture house, it was a story that would never die. In the early 1950s, Deadwood, Texas, was a quiet, humble town, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, and the sound of a car engine was enough to cause heads to turn. But even in such a peaceful town, secrets have a way of hiding beneath the surface, and the Dillon family were no exception. Jack Dillon, the father, was a man who kept to himself. He was in his late 30s when he moved to Deadwood with his wife, Evelyn, and their 2 children, Tommy and Sarah. The family's arrival in town was met with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Jack's reputation preceded him. People in town whispered that he wasn't the kind of man to be trusted. He kept his business to himself, and the few times anyone tried to engage with him, Jack's answers were always brief and curt. It didn't take long before the locals started noticing things. Small, odd things about the Dillon family. Jack always seemed to be in the company of strangers. People who appeared and disappeared in the dead of night. No one knew who these men were or where they came from, but they were always the same. Dark, shadowy figures with cold, calculating eyes. Jack himself wasn't the kind of man who smiled much. His eyes always seemed to carry a weight, as if there was something hidden just beneath the surface. And when people talked about him behind his back, the stories were always the same. Jack Dillon had connections to dangerous people. People who did things in the shadows, things that no one dared to speak about openly. But even in a town where rumors spread like wildfire, no one had concrete proof of what Jack was really involved in. It was all speculation, until that fateful evening when everything changed. It was a crisp autumn night in 1954, when Jack Dillon invited a few men over to his home. The townspeople weren't sure what the purpose of the gathering was, but they knew Jack well enough to stay out of it. He wasn't the kind of man to throw parties or entertain guests. His interactions were always kept to a minimum. The only time anyone saw him socializing was when he had business to discuss with his mysterious visitors. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, an unsettling silence fell over Deadwood. The usual sounds of life, the murmur of voices, the laughter of children playing in the streets, faded into a deep stillness. A few people in town noticed something strange about the air. It felt thick, heavy, like a storm was brewing in the distance. But there were no clouds, no hint of rain, just a strange, uncomfortable calm. Then, sometime after midnight, the screams began. At first, it was a faint sound, barely audible over the wind. But as the minutes passed, the screams grew louder and more desperate. They were high-pitched, frantic cries, like a soul in torment. The sound echoed through the empty streets of Deadwood, reaching the ears of everyone within a mile of the Dillon house. People rushed to their windows, hearts pounding, as the screams continued, each one more horrific than the last. The air was thick with tension, and the town seemed to hold its collective breath as the terrible cries pierced the night. No one dared to move at first, too stunned by the sheer violence in the air. But as the minutes stretched on, fear slowly began to overtake the townspeople, and they gathered in hushed groups, debating whether to go investigate. A handful of brave souls finally gathered their courage and made their way toward the Dillon house. The moonlight cast long shadows over the town as they trudged through the dusty streets, drawn toward the source of the screams. By the time they reached the house, the sound had stopped, but a heavy, suffocating silence had replaced it. The front door of the house was locked, just as it always was. There was no sign of life inside. The group hesitated before knocking on the door. There was no response. They tried again, but still nothing. As one of the men stepped forward to try the door handle, a chill ran through the air, as if the house itself was warning them to stay away. But the men didn't listen. They forced the door open, determined to get to the bottom of the noise they had heard. Inside, they found nothing but emptiness. The furniture was still in place, as though no one had ever moved. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence that anyone had been hurt. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. It was as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for someone to make a sound. They searched every room, but the only thing they found was a sense of unease, a thick layer of fear that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. It wasn't until they reached the basement that they found something disturbing. The door to the basement was slightly ajar, and as they descended the stairs, the temperature seemed to drop. The air was heavy with an unnatural cold, and the darkness seemed to grow thicker the further down they went. It was here, in the damp, shadowy depths of the house, that they found the first sign that something terrible had happened. On the floor, in the far corner of the room, was a pool of dark, sticky liquid. The smell hit them first, a sickening, metallic odor that burned the back of their throats. The liquid was thick, almost gelatinous, and as they stepped closer, they saw something that made their blood run cold. There, in the corner of the room, was a pile of discarded clothes. The clothing appeared to have been hastily removed, as though the owner had been in a hurry to escape. But there was no sign of the Dillon family. The group of men rushed upstairs to check the rest of the house, but it was clear now that something was horribly wrong. Jack, Evelyn, Tommy, and Sarah Dillon were gone. The house, once full of life, was now empty. The silence that followed was deafening. As the men left the house, they noticed something strange. The door was locked again. No one had entered or left, yet the house had seemingly returned to its normal, desolate state. The townspeople, now in a frenzy, began to search the surrounding area. They combed through the woods and the fields, hoping to find any trace of the family. But it was as if they had vanished into thin air. There were no signs of them, no footprints leading away from the house. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed them whole. Rumors began to spread. Some said the Dillons had been involved in something far darker than anyone had imagined. Others whispered that they were victims of a twisted game, a cruel ritual meant to bring the house its first taste of blood. But no one knew for sure. And as the days turned into weeks, the mystery of the Dillon family's disappearance remained unsolved. The torture house, once just a name on the edge of town, became a symbol of horror. And for those who dared speak of it, the Dillons were the first victims, a family that vanished without a trace, leaving behind only bloodstains and unanswered questions. In the summer of 1972, Deadwood, Texas, was much like it had always been. Quiet, small, and untouched by the world's fast pace. However, for Sarah and Mike, the town felt too slow, too predictable. They were a young couple, both in their early 20s, and they craved excitement. The mundane routines of life didn't appeal to them. They were thrill seekers, always on the lookout for an adventure, something that would give them a story to tell. One evening, over drinks at the local diner, they heard the whispers, rumors that had long since been passed around in hushed voices by the townsfolk. The torture house, abandoned for over a decade, was still a place that fascinated and terrified people. To many, it was a symbol of all things evil and unknown. To Sarah and Mike, it was simply an opportunity, a chance to prove to themselves and to each other that they weren't afraid of old ghost stories. Sarah, with her curiosity always getting the better of her, was the first to bring it up. "What if we went there?" she asked, her voice low, a mix of excitement and uncertainty. Mike, ever the adventurous one, didn't hesitate. "We'll be fine. It's just a house. An old house filled with rumors, nothing more," he said, flashing her a confident grin. And just like that, they made up their minds. The next night, they would head out to the edge of town, to the place that had haunted the townspeople's nightmares for years. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah and Mike set off toward the torture house. The road that led to it was narrow, overgrown with weeds and almost forgotten. The house was tucked away in a corner of the woods, far from the prying eyes of the town. But even as they walked closer, something felt different. The air seemed to grow heavier with each step they took, as though the very ground beneath them was warning them to turn back. When they arrived at the house, the sight of it almost made Sarah hesitate. The house was even worse up close. It looked as though it had been forgotten by time itself. The paint had peeled off the wooden frame, leaving it looking like a decaying skeleton. The windows were boarded up, and the front door hung loosely on its hinges, as though it might fall off at any moment. Despite the eerie appearance, Sarah couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The moment they would step inside and make their mark on Deadwood's darkest legend. They pushed open the door and stepped into the cold, musty air of the house. The floor creaked under their weight, and a cold draft swept through the rooms, sending a chill down their spines. As soon as they entered, they noticed something strange. It wasn't just the dampness or the age of the house. It was as if the house itself was alive, as if it was aware of their presence. The floors groaned, as if they were protesting the couple's intrusion, and the walls seemed to close in on them. "Is it just me, or does it feel wrong in here?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Mike laughed it off. "It's just an old house, Sarah. Don't let the stories get to you," he said, his voice trying to mask the unease creeping up his own spine. They wandered deeper into the house, their footsteps echoing in the hollow space. Each room they entered seemed more unnerving than the last. There was something off about every corner, every door. The house seemed to be in a state of decay, but not like any other abandoned house. It was as if something had caused the decay in a hurry, as if the house had been intentionally left to rot. In one of the rooms, they found strange symbols etched into the walls. Faint, jagged marks that looked almost like runes. They looked ancient, as if they had been carved into the wood with great effort. Sarah ran her fingers over one of the symbols, feeling a slight vibration under her fingertips. "Mike, look at this," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Mike came over, peering at the symbols, but said nothing. His gut instinct told him to leave, but his curiosity kept him rooted to the spot. Suddenly they heard it, faint whispers. At first they thought it was the wind, but then they realized the whispers were too deliberate, too distinct. They were words murmured in a language neither of them could understand. The sound seemed to come from all around them, as if the very walls of the house were speaking. Sarah's heart raced. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Mike looked at her, his face pale. "We should go," he said quickly, already moving toward the door. But as they turned to leave, something else happened. The door, the one they had just entered through, slammed shut with a violent force. Sarah and Mike froze, staring at the door as if it might open on its own. But the handle wouldn't budge. The door was locked. Panic set in. "Mike, open the door! Open it!" Sarah shouted, tugging on the handle with all her strength, but it wouldn't give. Mike, equally frantic, started pounding on the door, calling for help, but no one could hear them. The silence of the house seemed to grow thicker, suffocating them, pressing in on them from all sides. They turned around, looking for another way out. But the house seemed to have changed. The rooms they had explored earlier now felt different, darker, more oppressive. Shadows that hadn't been there before seemed to stretch and writhe, moving on their own,
as though they had a life of their own. A heavy, suffocating atmosphere filled the air, and Sarah could feel something, or someone, watching them.
They moved down the narrow hallway, but with every step, the house seemed to close in on them. The walls creaked, the floors groaned, and there were footsteps behind them, echoing in the empty halls. Mike spun around, but there was no one there. The house was empty, yet it didn't feel empty. "We need to get out of here. Now," Mike said, his voice shaking. He grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the back door. But as they reached it, it too slammed shut. The house was trapping them. They were being hunted by something they couldn't see, something that had waited for them to make the mistake of entering its domain. The air grew colder, and the whispers turned into guttural growls, the sound of something or someone moving just out of sight. Sarah screamed as she felt a hand brush against her shoulder. Cold, skeletal fingers that sent a chill of terror through her entire body. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there. And then, in the distance, they saw it. A figure standing at the end of the hallway, just beyond their reach. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, overwhelming. Mike grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward the stairs, but as they reached the first step, the house seemed to shift, the floor beneath them warping, the walls closing in. Suddenly, everything went silent. The whispering stopped, the footsteps ceased, and the figure was gone. It was as if the house had swallowed them whole. The front door, now unlocked, stood wide open, but it was too late. Sarah and Mike were gone. The house had claimed them, as it had claimed so many before. No one ever saw them again, and the house stood silent, its doors open, waiting for the next pair of foolish souls to enter. Some say they disappeared into thin air. Others claim they were swallowed by the house, their souls trapped forever, just like the others. But whatever the truth, one thing remains certain. The torture house had claimed its second victims, and the legend grew darker with each passing year. As the years passed, the whispers of the torture house never seemed to fade. Instead, they grew louder, carried on the wind, like an unsettling song that refused to die. The once bustling streets of Deadwood were now quieter, the people more nervous, and the town's dark secrets seemed to seep further into the cracks of everyday life. The torture house, still standing in its decaying glory, became a symbol of fear, mystery, and dread. But the legends surrounding it had evolved. It was no longer just a tale of the Dillon family's disappearance, or of Sarah and Mike's ill-fated exploration. It was about the souls trapped within, and the curse. Locals spoke in hushed tones of the cursed souls who were said to be trapped inside the house, their spirits forever bound to the land. It was no longer just the house itself that was feared, but the presence of those who had perished within its walls. These souls, tortured and twisted by the evil that resided there, were said to roam the house, endlessly searching for something, or someone. No one knew exactly what they wanted, but it was clear that they were angry, vengeful spirits, and the house had become their eternal prison. Every now and then, someone would catch a glimpse of something strange. A shadow moving behind the boarded-up windows of the house. A flicker of movement that vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. The bravest of the locals, those who dared venture close enough, swore they could feel eyes watching them from within the house. Some even claimed they could hear the faintest of whispers, soft and unintelligible, drifting on the breeze that swept through the decaying walls. At night, when the moon was high and the wind howled through the trees, there were reports of disturbing sounds emanating from the house, sounds that no one could explain. Heavy breathing, ragged and shallow, could be heard from the street. Chains dragging across the wooden floorboards, a sound that sent shivers down the spine of anyone who dared listen. The faintest, most unsettling sound of screams, distant, muffled, but unmistakably filled with pain. It was as though the house itself was alive, feeding off the suffering of those who had perished within it. Despite the fear that had taken hold of the town, some couldn't resist the lure of the torture house. They wanted to know more, to uncover the secrets that lay hidden behind the crumbling walls. But every person who ventured too far into the house, whether by accident or in search of answers, was left with the same feeling, an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something was always just behind them, watching, waiting. One night, a man named Frank Roberts, a local historian with a fascination for the strange and the unexplained, decided to investigate the house. He had heard the rumors, of course, but his interest went beyond mere ghost stories. He was determined to uncover the truth about the house's dark past and the souls that were said to be trapped inside. Armed with a flashlight and a notebook, Frank made his way to the house, his heart pounding with both excitement and unease. The moment he stepped inside, Frank felt the temperature drop. It was as though the house itself had rejected his presence. The air grew thick and heavy, and the musty scent of decay filled his nostrils. The floorboards creaked under his weight, and every step he took seemed to echo in the oppressive silence. Frank moved cautiously through the house, his flashlight illuminating the darkness in fleeting beams. As he explored the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He tried to brush it off as nerves, but the sensation wouldn't leave him. Every room he entered seemed to grow darker, colder. The shadows seemed to lengthen and twist, as though they had a life of their own. It wasn't long before Frank began to hear strange noises, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, footsteps that followed him. But when he turned, no one was there. The air grew thicker, more suffocating, and he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was in the attic, hidden behind a pile of old furniture and forgotten relics, that Frank made his discovery. He had been poking around, his curiosity growing by the minute, when he noticed a small door in the far corner of the room, half hidden by a stack of old crates. Without thinking, Frank approached the door, his heart racing. The door creaked open, and as he stepped inside, the air turned colder still. The small, dimly lit room was filled with strange, unsettling objects, rusty chains, broken chairs, and ancient-looking tools that seemed to be remnants of some forgotten ritual. Frank's eyes widened as he examined the items, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. The room smelled like death, a thick, putrid odor that seemed to cling to everything in the space. It was the kind of smell that made you want to gag, the kind of smell that seemed to soak into your skin and stay with you long after you left. As Frank stepped further into the room, he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. It wasn't just the smell. It was the oppressive feeling in the air, the sense that something terrible had happened here, that this room was a place of unimaginable suffering. It was then that he saw it. At the farthest corner of the room, standing motionless in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, with a long, flowing silhouette that seemed to blend into the darkness. Frank's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the figure, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching him. Frank's hand trembled as he held the flashlight, the beam of light flickering slightly. As his pulse quickened, he took a cautious step forward, but as soon as he did, the figure seemed to vanish. It was as though the darkness had swallowed it whole. Frank froze, his mind racing. Had he imagined it? Was it just a trick of the light? He stood there, motionless, waiting for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The room remained still, the air thick with silence. Deep down, Frank knew he hadn't imagined it. He had seen something that wasn't human. The figure had been there, and now it was gone, just as quickly as it had appeared. He didn't stay to investigate further. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to run, and so he did. As he exited the house, the feeling of being watched never left him. The whispers, the footsteps, the figure in the attic, it all haunted him, even after he had left the house behind. He tried to shake it off, to convince himself that it was just his imagination running wild. But deep down, he knew the truth. The house wasn't just haunted by the spirits of the past. It was alive, feeding off the suffering and fear of those who entered. The souls trapped within its walls were not at rest. They were angry, and they were waiting. Frank never spoke of what he saw in the attic again. He couldn't. The house had taken something from him, something he couldn't explain. And though he tried to put the memory behind him, he knew one thing for sure. The torture house would never let go of its cursed souls. They were trapped, forever bound to the house. And as long as it stood, their whispers would continue to echo through the halls. It was a crisp autumn evening when a group of 5 friends from Deadwood, filled with youthful bravado, decided to challenge the stories that had haunted their town for generations. Sarah, Mike, Ben, Lisa, and Josh had heard the rumors about the torture house their entire lives, but they weren't the types to shy away from urban legends. They had grown up in a town where everyone seemed to be afraid of something, and they were determined to prove that there was nothing to fear. They laughed at the notion of cursed souls and haunted houses, convinced it was all just a scare tactic, a story to keep children in bed at night. Armed with cameras and flashlights, the group set off toward the house. Their plan was simple: spend the night inside, film everything, and return with evidence to shut down the talk of ghosts and spirits forever. The house, looming at the edge of town, had been abandoned for decades, and as they approached, it seemed to stand there, unchanged and silent, watching them with its empty windows. As they crossed the threshold, a cold wind immediately greeted them, rushing through the broken door and lifting the hair on the back of their necks. The inside of the house was just as they expected: dusty, dilapidated, and eerily still. The walls were covered in peeling paint. The floorboards creaked with every step they took, and the air felt thick, heavy, as if the house had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to disturb its silence. "Welcome to the torture house," Mike said with a mocking grin as he filmed the others with his camera. "This is it, folks. The famous haunted house. Big deal." They all laughed, their voices bouncing off the cracked walls. But as they ventured deeper into the house, the atmosphere began to shift. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply. They could see their breath in the air, their warm exhales mingling with the coldness that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "This is creepy," Ben muttered, looking around nervously, though he was trying to play it cool. Lisa, who had never been fond of the stories surrounding the house, felt a shiver crawl up her spine. She turned to Josh, who was walking behind her. "This place, it feels wrong. Don't you feel it?" Josh didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on something at the far end of the hallway, a shadow that seemed to flicker, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. He blinked, trying to convince himself that it was nothing more than his imagination. But deep down, a creeping unease had begun to take root. They continued exploring, moving from room to room. At first it seemed like any other abandoned house, empty and decaying. But then, as they reached the second floor, things began to take a darker turn. The floorboards beneath them groaned louder with each step, and the temperature dropped further, making their breath visible. It was as if the house itself was alive, reacting to their presence. As they made their way down the hallway, Mike's camera suddenly flickered, its lens catching something in the corner of the frame, something that shouldn't have been there. It was a shadow, tall and thin, that seemed to stretch unnaturally along the wall, its edges blurring in and out of focus. Mike quickly turned around, but the hallway was empty. "Did anyone else see that?" he asked, his voice suddenly more serious than before. The others stopped in their tracks, exchanging uneasy glances. Ben, the most skeptical of the group, shrugged it off. It's probably just the old lighting or a trick of the camera. Don't let it get to you." But as they continued down the hall, the sense of being watched grew stronger. The whispers began, soft at first, faint murmurs that seemed to echo from all around them. "Did you hear that?" Lisa asked, her voice shaking slightly. She stopped walking, straining to listen. "Come on, it's nothing," Josh said, though his own voice lacked conviction. He moved to the front of the group and continued down the hall, urging the others to follow. But that was when it happened. A sudden gust of wind slammed a door shut behind them, so hard that the sound rang through the house like a gunshot. The group turned in unison, startled, but before they could even process what had happened, the whispers grew louder. They sounded like words now. Distinct, chilling words, as if they were being spoken right in their ears. "Get out! Get out!" The words were faint, but unmistakable. They all froze, the blood draining from their faces. "Who's there?" Sarah called out, her voice a mix of fear and disbelief. No response. "Did you hear that?" Ben asked, his voice tight with fear. "I'm done," Lisa said, her eyes wide with terror. She turned toward the stairs, ready to head back down. "I don't care about the video anymore. Let's get out of here." The others nodded, agreeing with Lisa. But as they reached the stairs, the door at the bottom of the landing slammed shut with a deafening bang. Their exit was blocked. Panicking, the group turned to look for another way out, but the house seemed to be shifting, its layout becoming increasingly unfamiliar. Hallways that had been straight and clear just moments before now twisted into dead ends. The rooms that had been open and empty seemed to change, as if the house were playing tricks on them. No matter where they turned, there was no escape. The whispers grew louder, the footsteps behind them more distinct. "We need to get out, now!" Mike shouted, his voice panicked as he led the group back to the front door. He tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Come on, Mike screamed, rattling the door, but it was locked from the inside. And that's when they heard it. The sound of dragging. The unmistakable sound of chains scraping across the floor. It was coming from upstairs, from deep within the house. And then, something worse. Screams. Terrified, blood-curdling screams. Like someone was being tortured, dragged across the floor. "Who's there?" Sarah shouted, her voice breaking. "Help us!" But there was no answer. Only the screams growing louder, closer. The group was frantic now. They sprinted toward the nearest window, desperate to escape. Ben was the first to reach it, his hands shaking as he tried to pry open the frame. The glass was old, brittle, and as Ben pushed with all his strength, it finally cracked open, allowing just enough room for them to climb through. One by one, they squeezed through the window, their hearts racing with fear and adrenaline. They tumbled onto the ground outside, gasping for air. For a moment, they just lay there. They had escaped, but they hadn't left empty-handed. The house had marked them, and as they looked back at the towering figure of the torture house, they knew something had followed them out. It wasn't just the house they had escaped. It was something far worse. The group made their way back to the town, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. They didn't speak as they walked, the terror of what they had experienced, too much to put into words. When they arrived back in Deadwood, they went straight to the sheriff's office, but when they tried to tell their story, no one believed them. They were just kids, scared by an old house. "You're just being dramatic," the sheriff said. "It's all just an old story. There's nothing there." But the friends knew better. The house hadn't just been haunted. It had been something worse, a living thing, feeding on their fear, marking them as its own. Soon after their return, another group of teenagers disappeared, just like the others before them. No one knew where they had gone, but the house seemed to hold on to its secrets, never letting anyone leave with their mind intact. The legend of the torture house grew darker, and the whispers became louder. And those who had witnessed the horrors inside, the ones who had dared to challenge the house, were never the same again. Their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. They left the town with their story, but no one ever believed them. Not until the next person vanished. Years had passed since the last group of thrill seekers had entered the torture house, and Deadwood had, in many ways, moved on. The town had changed in subtle ways. New businesses had opened, families had grown, and some of the older generations had passed on. Yet, the stories of the torture house, that cursed relic of the past, refused to fade. It lingered in the conversations of the elderly, in the whispers of children, and in the shadows of Deadwood's history. Some stories, it seemed, were simply too powerful to be forgotten. The house still stood on the outskirts of town, as dark and foreboding as ever, covered in overgrown vines that clung to its walls, like the tendrils of some malevolent creature. The house appeared to be rotting from the inside out. The once grand structure now looked like a decaying monument to all the evil that had been unleashed within its walls. The windows, once clear and open to the world, were now sealed tight, each one covered in wooden planks that appeared to have been hammered into place in a frantic attempt to keep something inside, or perhaps to keep it from escaping. The front door, a heavy wooden thing that had once welcomed the Dillons and their guests, was now chained shut, the rusty metal reflecting the dim light of the setting sun. Despite the state of disrepair, the house had an almost oppressive presence. No matter how much time passed, it seemed as though the very air around it was heavy with the weight of its dark history. The stories of its past, the screams, the shadows, the spirits, never ceased. And it was said that the house itself was not simply a place, but a living thing, a dark force that fed on the fear of those who ventured too close. Locals, particularly the older generations who had seen the house in its prime, spoke in hushed tones about the land itself being cursed. They said that the spirits of those who had suffered within the house still lingered, their souls trapped by the evil that had been unleashed upon them. Some of the bravest, or perhaps most foolish, people who dared to enter the house never returned, their disappearances chalked up to the house's insidious grip. Others who came out seemed forever changed, haunted by what they had witnessed, their minds fractured by the horrors they had experienced within those decaying walls. It wasn't just the ghost stories that kept people away. It was the feeling that something darker was at play. Something that had its claws firmly embedded in the very foundation of the house. The house wasn't merely haunted. It was alive, in a way. It seemed to breathe with the passing of time, growing stronger with every soul it claimed. The legend had taken on a life of its own, fed by the fear of those who spoke of it, those who dared to even think of it. Some believed the house itself had become a sentient being, one that fed off the fear and suffering of those who dared to enter its domain. And so the legend continued to grow, passed down from generation to generation. People would tell their children about the house, warning them to stay away. The younger folks, curious as always, would venture close, but none ever dared to cross the threshold. The house's reputation was too strong, its grip too terrifying. They might not have believed the stories, but they knew enough to stay far away from it. For those who had never visited Deadwood, the torture house was little more than an eerie footnote on the edge of the town's history. But for those who had grown up with its shadow looming, it was said that those who ventured too far into the house, those who dared to walk past the chained door, would be trapped forever, either absorbed into the house itself or claimed by the restless spirits who dwelled within. Some said the house would consume them entirely, leaving nothing behind but a dark stain on the ground where they had once stood. Others believed that the house would force them to relive their greatest fears, turning their minds into prisons of terror, leaving them broken and lost forever. For years, no one had dared to enter. The door remained chained, the windows sealed tight, and the house stood, a looming presence on the edge of Deadwood. But the stories, they never stopped. Every so often, someone would go missing, and the rumors would begin again. Someone would swear they'd seen a figure in the window or heard the sound of footsteps echoing from within. The house, though silent, never stopped calling, never stopped waiting for the next soul to wander too close. One such person was a curious young man named Tom, who had recently moved to Deadwood with his family. He had heard the stories, of course, but being new to the town, he wasn't fully aware of the fear the torture house instilled in everyone who lived there. To him, it was just another abandoned building, another part of town's forgotten past. Tom had grown up in a family that didn't believe in ghost stories, and so, naturally, he thought the tales of the haunted house were just that, tales. One afternoon, Tom decided to make his way to the house. He had heard the rumors, but he wasn't afraid. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight and a camera, he approached the torture house, determined to prove that it was all just nonsense. As he crossed the overgrown yard, The house seemed to stare at him, its boarded-up windows dark and uninviting. He stopped for a moment, standing at the front door, and for the first time, a shiver ran down his spine. It wasn't fear exactly, but a deep, unsettling feeling that crawled under his skin. But he shook it off. This was it. He was going to put the rumors to rest once and for all. He reached for the chains that locked the door, and just as his fingers brushed against them, something strange happened. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply as if the house itself was warning him. Tom hesitated for a moment, but then continued. The chains rattled as he removed them, and with a heavy groan, the door creaked open. Inside, the house felt wrong. It wasn't just the smell of decay or the silence. It was the oppressive weight of the place. The sense that something ancient and malevolent lingered within its walls. Tom stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, and for the first time, he began to wonder if the stories were true. The further he walked into the house, the more he felt it. A presence, watching him, following him, and then it happened. As he rounded a corner, the air seemed to shift. The shadows in the room grew darker, thicker, and the whispers began. At first, it was faint, barely audible. But then they grew louder, until they filled the space around him, calling out his name. His heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't bring himself to move. The whispers turned into growls, deep and guttural, and something shifted in the darkness. Something moved. Tom turned, but the hallway was empty. His breath came in shallow gasps as he backed away, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The door, the very same door he had just opened, slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. The house had claimed him, and as he was drawn deeper into its grasp, the final warning of the torture house became clear. Some places are best left untouched, and some stories, no matter how old they are, should never be tested. The house, still standing at the edge of town, continued to wait, and for those who were curious, for those who dared to enter, it would always be ready to claim its next victim.